Each year, military installations scattered across the most remote corners of the globe register anomalies that never make it into any public report. Radar returns with no physical origin, seismic signatures that bear no relation to known geological activity, and subsurface electromagnetic readings that cause entire banks of equipment to fail simultaneously without any recoverable explanation. It happens with a consistency that the world's major military powers find genuinely difficult to dismiss, and the classified departments tasked with logging these incidents, from the Pentagon's unacknowledged special access programs to the Soviet GRU's Department 6, which was dissolved in 1991, under circumstances that have never been fully explained, operated on budgets running into the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, because the anomalies kept multiplying and the rational explanations kept falling apart under scrutiny. Chile, a nation that spent the 1970s in the grip of one of the Western Hemisphere's most systematically documented military dictatorships, simultaneously served as a proving ground for covert Cold War operations that neither Washington nor Moscow ever intended to surface in any public forum. The Atacama Desert, minus 105,000 square kilometers of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, where annual rainfall measures in fractions of a millimeter and surface temperatures swing between -15 and 42 degrees Celsius within a single 24-hour cycle, became the preferred geography for this kind of work precisely because its desolation was absolute and its silence was guaranteed. For a brief period during the southern winter of 1978, a 5-man clearance team from Chile's Brigada de Inteligencia Territorial, a unit operating under direct DINA oversight, whose personnel files were classified at the highest level of the Pinochet government, was dispatched to inspect an abandoned radar installation 290 kilometers southeast of Antofagasta at 3,400 meters elevation, after automated seismic sensors detected a recurring subsurface movement pattern that matched no known natural phenomenon. What that team uncovered beneath the cracked concrete floor of that installation, a structure that appeared on no Chilean military blueprint and no Soviet diplomatic document, was something so fundamentally incompatible with any accepted understanding of physics, biology, or Cold War geopolitics that the regime sealed every associated record within 48 hours and transferred the surviving personnel to locations that, in several cases, do not appear on any public map. But what exactly had been living in that chamber for an indeterminate number of years beneath the Atacama sand? And why did the soldiers who looked directly at it come back, speaking in voices that their own families refused to recognize? The Atacama Desert sits along Chile's northern edge like a wound that the continent never healed, a plateau of cracked salt flats, oxidized rock formations, and volcanic ridgelines that stretch for hundreds of kilometers without a single tree, a single stream, or a single sign that anything biological was ever meant to survive there. At 3,400 meters above sea level, the air carries roughly 60% of the oxygen available at sea level, which means that even acclimatized military personnel operating in the region experience measurable cognitive degradation after 72 hours of sustained activity, slower reaction times, impaired judgment, a creeping dissociation from immediate physical reality that veteran soldiers consistently describe as feeling like thinking through wet concrete. The region surrounding the abandoned installation, designated internally by DINA as Sector Condor Tres, covered approximately 840 square kilometers of terrain, so geologically stable that seismic sensors placed there in the early 1970s could detect vibrations as subtle as a single person walking on the surface from a distance of 2 kilometers. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that when those same sensors began registering a rhythmic subsurface displacement pattern in the spring of 1977, a pattern that repeated every 4 hours and 19 minutes with a precision that no natural geological process could account for. The data was flagged, rerouted through 3 separate intelligence channels, and sat unanswered in a classified, DINA archive for 14 months before anyone with sufficient clearance decided it warranted a physical inspection. The Atacama has never been a place that human cultures approached without reverence or fear. The Atacamino people, the Licanante, whose civilization flourished in the region for over 3,000 years before Spanish contact, maintained an elaborate cosmology centered on the concept of the Gentiles, the remains of a pre-human race that they believed still inhabited the subterranean layers of the desert, neither living nor dead in any sense that their language had adequate words to describe. Spanish colonial records from 1589, preserved in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, document a report submitted by a Jesuit missionary named Padre Esteban de Villarreal, who described an incident near the Rio Loa Basin in which a group of Licanante miners refused to continue excavating a copper deposit after reportedly encountering what their elders called apiu sombra, a term that translates approximately as the shadow that has learned to stand. De Villarreal's account describes the miners emerging from the excavation in a state of complete psychological collapse, speaking in patterns their own community could not recognize, and insisting that something below the rock floor had watched them with an attention that felt, in his words, more considered than animal and more patient than human. The church suppressed the report within a year of its submission, and de Villarreal was reassigned to a mission in Paraguay, where he died under undocumented circumstances in 1592. The description of apiu sombra, something subterranean, something that observed, something that wore patience like a predator wears stillness, would surface again, nearly 4 centuries later, in the field notes of the men sent to inspect Sector Condor Tres, the Chilean military's own classified history with Sector Condor. Tres predates the 1978 inspection by at least a decade. Internal DINA memoranda declassified in partial form by the Chilean government in 2009, with significant redactions that a former intelligence analyst described to journalists as not protecting sources, but protecting the question itself. Reference a 1969 incident in which a 2-man technical team sent to perform routine maintenance on the radar installation failed to return to their base at Calama. A recovery team dispatched 4 days later found the installation structurally intact, all equipment functioning normally, and both men seated in the facility's main monitoring room facing the radar console, alive, responsive to basic commands, but completely unable to identify themselves, recognize their commanding officer, or produce any sound that the recovery team's report described as language in any conventional sense. Both men were transferred to a psychiatric facility outside Santiago within 48 hours, and their files were reclassified under a designation that, according to the 2009 partial disclosure, translated from the original administrative Spanish as recovered but not returned. The radar installation was officially decommissioned shortly after, its coordinates removed from active Chilean Air Force navigation charts, and Sector Condor Tres was redesignated as an unmonitored exclusion zone, until the seismic sensors nobody had thought to remove began transmitting again in 1977, and the pattern they reported was too precise and too deliberate to ignore a second time. On July 14, 1978, at 0600 hours local time, a military convoy consisting of 2 Land Rover Series 3 vehicles and 1 UAZ 469, a Soviet-manufactured utility truck whose presence in a Chilean military operation would itself have required a layer of administrative fiction to explain, departed the Calama Air Base heading southeast along a dirt track that appeared on no publicly available map. Leading the team was Teniente Primero Rodrigo Alfredo Sepulveda Bravo, 31 years old, 8 years in the Brigada de Inteligencia Territorial, a man his colleagues called Hueso, bone, not for any physical characteristic, but for the quality of his decision-making under pressure, which his commanding officer had once described in a fitness report as structural, load-bearing, and without visible flex. Alongside Sepulveda rode Sargento Primero Gustavo, Evalmino Rios, the team's senior technical specialist, a quiet man from Valparaiso who had spent 3 years attached to a signals intelligence unit and who carried, in addition to his standard field kit, a Soviet-manufactured R105M portable radio receiver that had been acquired through channels nobody in the convoy was prepared to discuss openly. The remaining 3 members were CBO Technico Ernesto Fondes Quiroga, the team's structural engineer, tasked with assessing whatever physical anomaly the seismic sensors had flagged. Soldado Especialista Tomas Vergara Nanez, a 23-year-old demolitions technician everyone called Polvo, dust, because, as Palomino once told it, the kid could make anything disappear without a trace. And Sabelio Luis Abelardo Cuevas Tapia, the team's medic, a heavy-set man from Temuco who had served 2 years in a military hospital outside Santiago and who had specifically requested reassignment to field operations because, as his transfer papers noted with bureaucratic blandness, he found clinical environments insufficiently variable. The convoy reached the outer perimeter of Sector Condor Tres at 1340 hours. After 7 hours of driving through terrain that transitioned gradually from compacted salt flat to loose volcanic gravel to a landscape that Fondes would later describe in his preliminary field notes as architecturally wrong, as if the ground had been arranged rather than formed. The installation itself came into view at 1347 hours. A low concrete structure, approximately 40 meters long and 12 meters wide. Its radar mast still vertical, but stripped of its antenna array. Its single-access door sealed with a military-grade padlock that had oxidized to the color of dried blood in the Atacama air. The temperature at arrival was -4 degrees Celsius, which was within expected range for the altitude and season. But Sepulveda noted in his field log, a document that would later be classified and then reportedly destroyed, though a partial transcription survived in a secondary intelligence archive, that the cold felt qualitatively different from standard high-altitude cold. "It doesn't come from the air," he wrote. "It comes from below." Palomino calibrated his R105M receiver, while Fondes photographed the exterior, and within 11 minutes of arrival, the receiver registered a signal on a frequency that Palomino immediately identified as outside the range of any equipment he had ever been trained to operate. A low, cycling tone at approximately 18.7 Hz, subaudible but physically perceptible as a vibration in the sternum and the back molars, repeating every 4 minutes and 19 seconds with absolute mechanical regularity. Sepulveda ordered the padlock cut at 1412 hours, and the access door opened inward with a resistance that Fondes estimated at roughly 3 times what the door's visible condition should have produced, as if something on the other side was maintaining a pressure differential that the desert air outside immediately began equalizing with the sound Vergara described as a breath, but going the wrong direction, like something inhaling a room. The interior of the installation was in a state of preservation that made no physical sense, given that the structure had been officially unoccupied for 9 years. The radar console in the main monitoring room was dusty, but structurally intact. The metal folding chairs were still arranged around the central table. A ceramic coffee mug sat on the console's left edge, and when Cuevas picked it up, reflexively, the way a person picks up an object to confirm it's real, the mug was warm. Not residually warm. Not warm in the way that metal sometimes retains heat in an enclosed space. Warm the way a mug is warm when someone has been holding it. Cuevas set it back down without a word, and nobody in the room acknowledged what had just happened, because acknowledging it would have required one of them to propose an explanation, and none of the explanations available were ones that trained military intelligence personnel were prepared to say out loud in a dark room 300 kilometers from the nearest town. Palomino's receiver continued registering the 18.7 Hz signal throughout the interior sweep, and at 1438 hours, it began registering something additional, a secondary pattern overlaid on the base frequency. irregular in a way that the base signal was not, varying in amplitude and rhythm in a manner that Palomino would spend the next 4 hours trying to classify before writing in his technical log, with visible reluctance, the single word, respiration, breathing. Fondes located the subsurface anomaly at 15:09 hours. In the northeast corner of the main monitoring room, beneath a section of concrete floor that had been overlaid with a sheet of corrugated steel, bolted at its four corners, ground-penetrating acoustic measurements indicated a void space of significant dimensions, at minimum 8 meters deep, the lateral extent unmeasurable with the equipment available. The bolts securing the steel sheet were Soviet manufactured, a detail Fondes photographed 3 times from different angles because his hands were shaking and he needed the repetition to feel like methodology rather than panic. They removed the steel sheet at 15:31 hours and found a shaft approximately 2 meters in diameter, dropping vertically into darkness, its walls lined with a metal alloy that none of them recognized. Not aluminum, not steel, something with a surface texture that Fondes described as almost biological, the way bone has texture if you look closely enough. Sepulveda dropped the flare. It fell for what his field watch measured as 4 full seconds before hitting bottom, which at standard gravitational acceleration would place the floor at approximately 78 meters below the surface, a depth that no construction project of that scale could have been executed in the Atacama without leaving some record in regional seismic monitoring data, in geological surveys, in satellite photography, in anything. The flare hit the bottom, and its light spread laterally, and in the 3 to 4 seconds before it began to dim, every man standing around that shaft saw the same thing. The chamber below was not empty. It was not a storage space, not an equipment vault, not anything that any military doctrine or engineering manual they had ever encountered would have prepared them to categorize. Standing in the reddish light of the descending flare, at the far edge of the chamber's visible floor was a figure, upright, proportioned like a man, dressed, or appearing to be dressed, in what looked from 78 meters above like a Chilean military uniform. It did not move when the flare hit. It did not move when the light spread. It simply stood there, oriented toward the shaft, as if it had been waiting, not recently, not impatiently, but with the specific stillness of something that had been waiting long enough that waiting had become its natural state. Vergara grabbed Sepulveda's arm. Palomino stepped back from the shaft's edge. Cuevas said nothing, but his medical kit hit the floor because his hands had opened without him deciding to open them. And then the figure below tilted its head, slowly, at an angle slightly beyond what a human cervical spine permits, and looked up. And whatever was looking up at them from the bottom of that shaft was wearing Sepulveda's face. Sepulveda pulled the teen back from the shaft at 15:37 hours and secured the steel sheet over the opening with 2 of the original bolts and a length of equipment cord, a measure that everyone present understood to be psychologically necessary rather than physically meaningful, because whatever was down there had presumably been down there for years, and a piece of nylon rope was not going to be the variable that changed its situation. He attempted to raise Kalama base on the standard UHF frequency at 15:41 hours and got nothing, not static, not interference, but a specific quality of silence that Palomino, monitoring the R105M simultaneously, identified as active signal suppression rather than simple atmospheric failure. The 18.7 Hz subsurface tone had not stopped. If anything, Palomino noted in his technical log, it had shifted slightly upward in frequency since the shaft was opened, from 18.7 to approximately 19.4 Hz. Still subaudible, still registering in the chest and jaw, but now accompanied by something Palomino described as directionality, as if the signal was no longer simply emanating from below, but was being aimed at specific points in the room. Fondes set up his portable acoustic measurement equipment along the perimeter of the main monitoring room and spent 40 minutes mapping the subsurface. void's lateral dimensions, and what he found restructured the team's understanding of what they were dealing with in a way that the installation's exterior had not prepared them for. The chamber below was not 8 meters wide. Based on acoustic return times, it was at minimum 60 meters in diameter, roughly the footprint of a full city block, and its walls, wherever his instruments could reach them, registered a material density and thermal conductivity profile that matched nothing in his engineering reference manuals. Vergara had been quiet since the shaft. He was sitting against the eastern wall of the monitoring room with his demolitions kit open in his lap, not inventorying it, just keeping his hands busy. And when Sepulveda crouched next to him and asked for a status report, Vergara looked up and said, with the specific flatness of a man who has made a decision about how much of his internal experience he is going to permit himself to express, that the face down there had not just looked like Sepulveda. It had looked like Sepulveda, the way a photograph looks like a person, accurate in every measurable detail and wrong in every way that measurement can't capture. Palomino found the documents at 16:48 hours in a metal filing cabinet in the installation's secondary room, a space that the original DINA briefing had described as a storage area, but which contained, in addition to 3 empty equipment crates and a Soviet-manufactured portable generator, a cabinet whose bottom drawer was sealed with a wax stamp, bearing a marking that Palomino recognized immediately and that caused him to call Sepulveda over without touching anything further. The stamp was a GRU classification seal, Soviet military intelligence, the same organization whose Department 6 had been flagged in preliminary DINA briefings as a possible source of the installation's anomalous construction. Scene 40. Inside the drawer were 41 pages of documents in Russian, a language none of the team read, accompanied by 17 pages of handwritten notes in Spanish that appeared to have been produced by a translator working under significant time pressure, given that several passages were crossed out and rewritten. Several others were simply abandoned mid-sentence, and 2 pages near the end were stained with something that the team's medic Cuevas examined briefly and identified, without elaborating, as biological in origin. The Spanish notes were fragmentary, but coherent enough to establish a basic operational history. The installation had been constructed between 1962 and 1965 under a bilateral intelligence arrangement between the Jew and DINA as predecessor organization, the SIFA, the Servicio de Inteligencia de la Fuerza Aérea, using a construction crew that the documents referred to only as personnel of the third category, a designation that appeared nowhere in any Chilean military classification system that Sepulveda had ever encountered. The chamber below had not been built. According to the translated notes, the chamber had been found during the initial excavation for the installation's foundation at a depth of approximately 12 meters, when drilling equipment broke through into a void space that the construction team's geologist described in his report as of non-geological origin, exhibiting material properties inconsistent with any known terrestrial formation process. The Soviet and Chilean intelligence officers who arrived to assess the discovery spent 11 days below before submitting a joint report that the Spanish notes summarized in a single translated sentence: Lo que habita la cámara, no lego alley. Siempre estuvo. What inhabits the chamber did not arrive there. It was always there. The notes referred to the entity, singular, always singular, despite the face at the bottom of the shaft having implied to at least 2 team members the possibility of multiples, by a designation that combined a Giroux alphanumeric code with a Spanish phrase that the translator had written, then crossed out and rewritten in larger letters as if repetition would make it more manageable. El que aprende caras, the one that learns faces. According to the 1965 assessment, the entity had demonstrated the ability to reproduce the physical appearance of any human being it observed for longer than approximately 90 seconds, not as a visual illusion, not as a holographic projection, but as a complete biological reconstruction accurate enough, that's standard. Military identification protocols were unable to distinguish the reproduction from the original. Sepulveda heard it first. He held up a closed fist, the universal military signal for freeze, and every man in the room stopped breathing at the same moment. And in that silence, the sound was unmistakable. A rhythmic impact against metal, coming from the direction of the sealed shaft, consistent with the sound of a person climbing a ladder. Except the shaft had no ladder. Palomino's R105M receiver spiked at 1719 hours, the needle hitting the far end of its range and holding there, and every fluorescent tube in the installation flickered simultaneously and died, leaving the team in the light of two tactical flashlights and the fading amber glow of a late Atacama afternoon coming through the installation's single exterior window. The climbing sound continued. It was not fast. It was not panicked. It had the cadence of something that knew exactly where it was going and had no particular reason to hurry. Vergara had two N26 fragmentation grenades out of his kit and in his hands before. Sepulveda finished issuing the order, and Fandez had moved to the eastern wall with his back against it and his sidearm drawn, and Cuevas had positioned himself near the access door in a way that suggested he had already done a private calculation about the distance to the vehicles outside and found it inadequate. The climbing stopped at 1722 hours. 3 minutes of absolute silence followed. The 18.7 hertz tone gone. The R105M needle dropped back to zero. The installation completely acoustically dead in a way that felt less like quiet and more like the desert holding its breath. And then, from directly beneath the steel sheet covering the shaft, came a sound that Cuevas would describe 14 years later to a journalist working on a story that was never published. A sound that he said he had never found adequate language for in either Spanish or any other language he'd tried, which he eventually characterized simply as someone knocking from the inside, the way you knock when you already know the door is going to open. The steel sheet came off the shaft at 1724 hours without any visible mechanism. The equipment cord simply separated at its midpoint, both halves retracting toward opposite walls as if something below had exhaled, and the corrugated metal lifted 4 centimeters off the concrete floor and slid laterally with a sound like a blade being drawn across stone before settling against the eastern wall with a finality that suggested it would not be moved back. What rose from the shaft did not climb. There was no gripping of edges, no physical exertion, no sound of displaced air. The figure simply ascended at a rate that matched a person walking up a staircase at a measured pace, unhurried, geometrically steady, and when it cleared the shaft's lip and stood upright in the monitoring room, it was wearing Sepulveda's face with a precision that went beyond the physical. It was wearing his posture, the specific way Sepulveda carried his left shoulder fractionally lower than his right, a compensation for an old training injury that nobody in the room had ever consciously registered until they saw it reproduced. It was wearing the particular stillness of a man who has learned to control his reactions under pressure, and it stood in the dying afternoon light of the installation's monitoring room and looked at the 5 soldiers arrayed against the walls with an expression that Vergara would later describe as recognition not of who we were, but of what we were about to do. Sepulveda fired first. 2 rounds, center mass, standard double tap, the muscle memory of 8 years of field training executing itself before conscious decision had fully formed. Both rounds connected. The sound was correct. The physical impact response was correct. The figure staggered in the anatomically appropriate manner. And then it straightened, and where the entry wounds should have been, there was instead a slow surface distortion, like a reflection on water after a stone has passed through it, the figure's surface rippling and then resolving back to stillness. And Sepulveda's face looked back at Sepulveda from across the room with an expression that had not changed. Vergara threw the first grenade at 1726 hours. The detonation in the enclosed space was catastrophic in terms of noise and pressure. Every man in it. The room experienced immediate tinnitus, and two of them, Faundes and Cuevas, were knocked off their feet by the concussive wave. The figure was inside the blast radius. When the smoke cleared enough to see across the room, it was still standing. But it was different now. The Sepulveda configuration was gone. What stood in the smoke and concrete dust was taller, noticeably, wrongly taller, the proportions subtly altered in a way that the brain registered as threat before the eyes could articulate the specific measurements. And its surface was cycling, moving through configurations with an increasing speed that made it difficult to focus on directly, like trying to read text on a spinning surface. Cuevas saw his own face in the cycle. It lasted less than 2 seconds, his features assembling and then dissolving back into the shifting surface. But 2 seconds was enough, he said afterward, in the account he gave to no official body, but to his own brother in a letter written in 1984. That seeing his own face on that thing was the moment he understood, with a completeness that no subsequent rational analysis was able to dislodge, that it had been watching each of them individually, cataloging them, and that the Sepulveda configuration had not been a threat display or a coincidence, but a demonstration. It had shown them the most authoritative face in the room. Palomino's R105M receiver exploded at 17:28 hours, not from the grenade concussion, which had occurred 2 minutes earlier, but spontaneously, the casing fracturing outward from some internal pressure event, the components scattering across the floor in a pattern that Palomino, pressing himself against the wall with fragments embedded in his forearm, noted with the detached observational habit of a trained signal specialist, was not consistent with any failure mode I have ever seen in this equipment or any other. The fluorescent tubes, dead since 1719, lit simultaneously at full intensity and then continued beyond full intensity, brightening past any output their hardware should have been capable of until the room was white and formless, and Faundes lost the walls. The walls came back, but the room's geometry had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would read as impossible in a photograph, but in the way that a familiar room changes in a fever dream. The proportions were wrong, by margins too small to measure and too large to ignore, the corners meeting at angles that seemed correct until you tried to place your body in relation to them. The single exterior window, now positioned approximately 40 centimeters lower than it had been when they entered, admitting a rectangle of evening sky that seemed, to Vergara, to be the wrong color for the time of day. The entity had multiplied, not dramatically, not all at once, but between one moment and the next, there were two configurations standing in the room where there had been one, and between that moment and the next, there were three, each one distinct, each one drawn from the faces of the men present, arranged in a loose arc that was closing with the patience of something that understood geometry as a tool rather than a constraint. Faundes made it to the access door and got it open, a fact that surprised him, he would say later, because some part of him had expected it to be sealed, expected the installation to have become a closed system. And the Atacama evening came in cold and immediate and real in a way, but the air inside the room had stopped being, and he shouted for the others, and heard them moving behind him, and did not look back, because looking back meant seeing the configurations, and seeing the configurations meant the 90 seconds the document had described, the 90 seconds of observation, and he was not going to give it 90 seconds. Vergara threw the second grenade back through the open door as they cleared the threshold, not at anything specific, just into the room, into the light and the wrong angles and the cycling faces, and the detonation blew the access door off its hinges and knocked all 5 men to the ground on the concrete apron outside the installation. Sepulveda rolled onto his back and looked up at the Atacama sky, and it was the right color, the right depth, the right absolute indifference of a desert sky at 17:31 hours in the middle of winter, and he allowed himself 4 seconds of that before he got up and ordered everyone to the vehicles. They were 12 meters from the Land Rovers when Cuevas stopped, Sepulveda turned. Cuevas was standing completely still, facing back toward the installation, and the expression on his face was the one that Sepulveda had seen on men in the field when they have registered something that their training has no protocol for. Not fear exactly, but the specific recalibration of a mind, encountering a category of information it was not built to process. Standing in the installation's blown open doorway, backlit by the impossible white interior light that had not gone out despite the detonations, were three figures. They were not cycling anymore. They had resolved into three stable configurations: Sepulveda, Vergara, and Cuevas, and they stood in the doorway with their hands at their sides and watched the five men at the vehicles with an attention that felt, even at 12 meters, even in the open desert, even under the indifferent Atacama sky, like something that had all the time in the world and had already decided how this ended. The convoy had covered approximately 4 kilometers of dirt track, heading northwest, and the Land Rover carrying Fondes and Cuevas lost all electrical systems simultaneously, headlights, ignition, instrumentation, and coasted to a stop in the middle of the track with the specific finality of a vehicle that has been switched off rather than one that has failed. Sepulveda brought the second vehicle alongside and had made the decision to transfer personnel and abandon the dead Land Rover when Palomino, his forearm wrapped in field dressing and his expression carrying the particular focus of a man using professional concentration as a structural replacement for the emotional processing he was deferring indefinitely, pointed northeast and said one word: helicoptero. The aircraft was a Puma SA-330 Chilean Air Force markings, running without navigation lights in a way that suggested it had not arrived accidentally. It came in low and fast from the northeast and set down on the salt flat 40 meters from the convoy with a precision that indicated the pilot had been given exact coordinates, and before the rotors had fully spooled down, 4 men in unmarked fatigues had exited the aircraft and established a perimeter that was oriented, Sepulveda noted immediately, not toward the darkness beyond the convoy, but toward the installation visible 4 kilometers to the southeast, toward the white light still emanating from its blown-open doorway, steady and sourceless, and utterly indifferent the 2 grenade detonations that should have ended it. The man who stepped out last from the Puma was not in uniform. He wore civilian field clothing and carried no visible weapon, and moved across the salt flat with the unhurried authority of someone who had been to places like this before and had developed, through repetition, a functional relationship with the specific category of wrong that places like this produced. He introduced himself to Sepulveda as Senor Valdez, no rank, no unit, no further identification, and shook Sepulveda's hand with the brief mechanical formality of someone completing a required gesture before moving to the actual business, which was to stand beside Sepulveda and look southeast at the light and say, quietly, in the tone of a man confirming a diagnosis he had already made from the referral notes: "Cuántos se mostraron?" How many showed themselves? Sepulveda said 3. Valdez nodded, as if 3 was a number that meant something specific to him. Not surprising, not alarming, but categorically informative in the way that a test result is informative to a physician who ordered the test expecting a particular range. He asked whether any of the team had been observed for longer than 90 seconds at close range. And the way he asked it, the specific precision of the threshold, 90 seconds, the same figure from the translated documents, told Sepulveda that Valdez had read the 1965 assessment, and that the 1965 assessment was not the first document of its kind that Valdez had read. Cuevas was examined by one of the 4 uniformed personnel. A medical evaluation conducted with equipment that Cuevas, himself a trained medic, did not recognize, and cleared with a qualification that the examiner conveyed to Valdez in a low voice, but that Cuevas, standing close enough, heard clearly. Observado pero no fiado. Observed but not fixed. The distinction apparently mattered. Vergara and Fondes were examined next, then Palomino, whose forearm wounds from the receiver's spontaneous disintegration were dressed with materials from the Kyriels from the Puma's medical kit that were more sophisticated than anything the Chilean military standard field inventory would have explained. At 18:31 hours, Valdez made a radio call on equipment that bore no manufacturer markings and spoke for approximately 4 minutes in a combination of Spanish and what Palomino identified as Russian, functional, accented, the Russian of someone who had learned it for professional rather than cultural reasons. And when he ended the call, he turned to Sepulveda and told him that an air asset would be on station in 40 minutes and that the team needed to be at minimum 8 kilometers from the installation before then. He said it without drama, the way a person relays logistical information, and the implication of what an air asset arriving 40 minutes after his radio call would do to a structure 4 kilometers away, settled over the convoy with a weight that nobody chose to articulate. They drove. The bed Land Rover was pushed off the track and left, a piece of Chilean military equipment abandoned in an exclusion zone. One more thing that would need to be administratively disappeared, and the remaining vehicle and the Puma covered the distance in convoy, the helicopter flying low and slightly behind. And at 18:42 hours, Sepulveda checked his field watch and noted that they had reached the 8-kilometer threshold and pulled to a stop, and everyone got out because some moments require standing. The airstrike came at 18:49 hours. 2 passes, the aircraft unlit and unidentified, the ordnance impacting with a precision that suggested prior target coordinates rather than visual acquisition. The installation ceased to exist as a structure in approximately 11 seconds. The white light went out with the first impact, instantly, completely. And the secondary explosions that followed were conventional in every respect. The sound and light and pressure wave of things burning that were built to burn. And the Atacama absorbed it all with the indifference of terrain that has been absorbing human decisions for 3,000 years. Palomino was watching the strike through field binoculars and said nothing during it and said nothing after it. And then, approximately 30 seconds after the last secondary detonation, lowered the binoculars and said to nobody in particular that the light had gone out too fast, that an energy source capable of sustaining that output through 2 grenade detonations should not have extinguished with the first impact, that it going out that fast meant either the strike had hit something specific that was its source, something locatable, something with a physical address, or it had gone out because it chose to. Nobody responded to that. Valdez, standing 6 meters away, may or may not have heard it. If he did, his expression gave nothing back. He was looking southeast at the column of smoke rising from where the installation had been, and whatever he was thinking about what Palomino had just said, or about the chamber 60 meters below the surface that no airstrike on the structure above it would have touched, or about the 3 configurations that had stood in the doorway watching 5 men run. He kept it in the category of things that Senator Valdez, no rank, no unit, kept to himself as a matter of what appeared to be long professional habit. The convoy reached Calama at 0214 hours the following morning. Before the vehicles had stopped, 4 men in civilian clothing were waiting at the base's secondary entrance, not the main gate. The secondary entrance, which meant someone had known which entrance they would use, and the debriefing began before anyone had eaten or slept, conducted in a room with no recording equipment that any of the team could identify, by men who asked questions with the specific efficiency of people, confirming what they already knew, rather than discovering what they didn't. The official record of what happened at Sector Condor, Tres on July 14, 1978, is a document of remarkable administrative creativity, a routine, decommissioning inspection, 0 anomalies, demolition attributed to standard engineering disposal, 5 soldiers returning from an unremarkable field assignment. The Jew documents found in the installation's secondary room appear in no inventory. The 41 pages of Russian intelligence materials and their handwritten Spanish translation were never logged, never filed, and never mentioned again by anyone with a rank that would have required them to mention it. Teniente Primero Rodrigo Sepulveda Bravo was reassigned to a Santiago desk within 3 weeks, a merit promotion. His file said. Colleagues described him afterward as professionally functional and personally absent, carrying behind his eyes the specific distance of a man who has decided that what he has seen is enough. He retired in 1985 and died of a cardiac event in 1993. His autopsy report is classified. Sargento Palomino was transferred to Punta Arenas, 3,100 kilometers south, within 30 days. He served there 11 years, retired into deliberate obscurity, and died in 2007. The letter describing what he saw in the installation was found among family papers after his death and passed to a journalist whose investigation was acquired by an unnamed party and never published. Sabio Fondes was placed in a residential facility outside Rancagua within 72 hours. His wife's second supervised visit produced a single reported observation that the man inside responded to her name but didn't seem to know why he should. He died there in 1997. His daughter was 18. Soldado Vergara's service record ends on July 15, 1978, the day after the operation, with the notation, status, pending resolution, never updated, a designation a Chilean military archivist described in 2014 as one she had never encountered in 30 years of records work. His mother filed a missing persons report in October 1978. It was closed in 2 weeks. She filed again in 1981. That second report simply disappears from the archive after its submission date, as if it had been there and then decided not to be. Sajabu Cuevas was the only one who returned to something resembling a normal life. Civilian nurse, 22 years in a Concepcion hospital, died in 2009. He never spoke publicly about Sector Condor Tres. His son remembered one habit his father maintained without exception for the last 30 years of his life. Every morning, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror for exactly 89 seconds, 1 second short of 90, before turning away. The chamber beneath the coordinates was never excavated, never investigated, never acknowledged. Satellite imagery taken between 1982 and 2019 shows undifferentiated desert salt flat, volcanic gravel, no surface indication of anything built or buried. Whether LQ Eprende Caras remains where it has always been, or whether the 5 men around that shaft were the last humans it catalogued, or simply the most recent, are questions the Chilean government has declined to address, and the dissolved GAVE is no longer in a position to answer. What is known is this: a Chilean geological survey conducted in 2003, passing within 6 kilometers of Sector Condor Tres for unrelated mineral extraction purposes, registered on its automated seismic instruments a recurring subsurface displacement pattern at those exact coordinates. Every 4 hours and 19 minutes, with absolute mechanical regularity, as if whatever produces it has never stopped, as if it is simply waiting for the next team to be sent. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.